Taylor Lorenz is going full-blown meltdown over Pete Buttigieg. She's accusing him of embracing far-right eugenics. Lorenz lashed out at the former transportation secretary after comments he made during a recent interview with the Bulwark's Tim Miller. Let's watch.
For the love of God, figure out a way to get the schools open sooner. We got very knee-jerk about this. Most people involved would like to be able to have found a way to safely get more schools open more quickly.
So Lorenz was less than enthused, writing on X, quote, Pete saying he would have opened schools sooner in 2020, aka killing more vulnerable people faster, sacrificing teachers and educators and kids' lives to force them back into unventilated buildings with no protections, discussing how Dems have fully embraced far-right eugenics.
Meanwhile, Buttigieg is once again the subject of 2028 presidential speculation by slamming Democrats. Buttigieg, in that same appearance, blasted what he called Democrats' cultural struggle and how they talk about Trump. Let's take a look.
There's a condescension that is imputed to Democrats that I think we really need to deal with. We've said and done things that make voters feel like we're talking about them when we're talking about him.
Far-right eugenics. So Taylor Lorenz actually was on Rising 2 weeks ago. I had a longer interview with her. Longtime viewers know that she is a friend of mine, even though I disagree with her strenuously on not just COVID, but a bunch of other topics, and we got into some of them. It was a polite interview, though. Viewers should go back and watch that if they want. I obviously do not agree with her that Pete Buttigieg is far right. If only he was far right. He is, agreeing with the now very common sense prevailing wisdom that the reluctance to open schools was not sound science, was not good policy, was frustrating and difficult for a lot of people, made no sense at the time because you had schools were the most shut down sector of our society. Like you could go to bars and restaurants and other things were open, but you couldn't, people had to go back to work in a lot of sectors, but the schools were closed. You know, schools being, I know there's teachers can be older, but the students themselves being the least at risk COVID group there is because of the age curve with COVID mortality. It didn't make any sense at all, and I would chalk it up to the disproportionate influence of the teachers' unions over the Democratic Party. Taylor thinks that that was going to be some kind of mass slaughter. I would just point to statistics showing, again, not a wild differentiation in COVID outcomes from such policies as school closures and mask mandates and social distancing and other mitigation efforts. There's not a major differentiation in deaths until you get well into the vaccination campaign, where failure to vaccinate older Americans, not the mass vaccination as we argued about the other day, but failure to vaccinate at-risk people corresponding with greater death.
I actually find it a bit admirable that Buttigieg can say hindsight is 2020 and look back and say, obviously, we were trying to do our best in a once-in-a-century pandemic, and we made some decisions that we probably wouldn't have made, which is hard to make when something hasn't happened in your lifetime previously. The school closures did cause issues. I have teachers that are friends, social, emotional, financial issues for parents of kids. So I understand there's like a layer of things that probably could have been prevented. But what I know is that people were just doing their best to try to protect the teachers and other people in the school, not knowing how prevalent it would be amongst kids, how many kids could potentially get emergency room visits because of it, and I know that that all was explored after. So hindsight is 2020. But where I disagree with Pete Buttigieg is then criticizing the entire Democratic Party and finding a moment to then say, I'm distanced from them, they don't really get it, and we need to find a new way to communicate, because what he should be doing is just taking the time since he stepped away from running for president, since he stepped away from the limelight, which has been a lot less than we've seen him in the past right now.
Did he ever step away from the limelight?
I mean, I think he shows up sporadically. He doesn't, not as, like when he was running, obviously we saw him all the time. And so I think that now he can sit back and talk to his same party and say, hey, what are we running on? What is the platform of 2026? What's our plan? What is our midterm plan? What's our long? Because only with Democrats being effective from 2026 to 2028, will Democrats have a better chance in 2028 of actually arguing, see, when we switch the Congress over, here's what we've accomplished, here's why we should take over the presidency, because we'll help get rid of some of the things that we didn't like that Trump did and do way better. And so I think that Pete Buttigieg is misguided with taking this tactic on. I don't think that's a real solution. But I do agree and appreciate that he can look back and reflect, which I wish more leaders in both parties would do.
The only thing I would respond to about the it's all hindsight point is that it wasn't that everyone did this policy, though, right? This policy was done disproportionately in Democratic-controlled areas and then also in terms of public schools versus private schools. I have a bunch of nieces and nephews back in my home state of Michigan who are in Catholic school, and there was the initial shutdown that everyone did in the spring of, what year is this, 2020. But then when fall came around, the public schools, they remained shut down or virtual. The private schools, the Catholic schools, the kids went back to school. They weren't shut down. That was true here in Virginia, too. I remember seeing a study of the Catholic schools, and you don't see, again, any difference in terms of mortality among people proximate to the school systems. It just didn't make any difference.
I don't think it was done to follow along an agenda.
But I think, of course it was done to follow an agenda.
No, I think
it was teachers' unions didn't want to go to work.
No, I don't. You always have some conspiracy theory.
That's not a conspiracy theory.
No, I believe that people
They had a nice deal where they were going to get paid even to stay at home, so they decided to stay at home.
I thought that it was just people trying to protect students from everyone else that's involved in the life of a child. And so even if the students are resilient, and like you said, there's not that many students that are deeply affected by COVID, yes, they would have an easier rate of getting over it. But when they go home and some of the people that take care of them are grandparents, when they go home and their parents have an autoimmune disease, who takes care of you now? Yes, you might be brilliant in school, but if your parents and grandparents that do take care of children a lot are ailing, that pick you up from the school
Wasn't that a reason to put them in school rather than...
No, because they come home and so... You have nieces and nephews, so when you see them often, you know that they're probably always sick. You're probably like, why are you always sick?
Yeah.
They go to school.
They get sick all the time.
Germs run rampant. So if you can bring down the amount of germs that people might have access to, that was something that we were worried about, the sickness, the coughing on each other. Tell me which 5-year-old is going to keep a mask on. Tell me what 10-year-old is going to keep a mask on.
Well, that's why requiring them to mask was stupid.
Yeah, but we were trying to protect them from then infecting the older people in their family.
But they're more likely to be around older people if they were stuck at home. Because, I mean, these are...
But the older people
their parents still had to work. Their parents had to go places, so they needed people to supervise them. I mean, frankly, the public school system, in addition to education, perhaps more so even than education, because it doesn't, in some municipalities, doesn't even do a very good job of teaching kids to read and do math. It serves as a daycare role, because parents have to work. And so when you just shut down the daycare role, and you can't replace the daycare function, we can argue with virtual schools, even though I think virtual education did a terrible job.
Yeah,
at least you can, I guess, do the educational function. You do it badly with virtual school, but you can't serve, the daycare function is only served by having the kids being taken care of somewhere outside their home. And they just shut that down. Well, somebody's got to watch the kids if parents got to go to work. So then it's going to be grandparents and older relatives anyway, which is the exact circumstance we were trying to prevent. So it made absolutely no sense to me.
I'm not arguing that a blanket decision made was right or wrong, and I'm not saying that there weren't missteps in a disease or pandemic style event that only happens once, probably, if ever, in your lifetime.
I hope it never
I think that people actually tried their best.
I hope I'm dead and buried before the next time it happens. Please, God.
Yeah, nobody wants that to happen again. It was a disaster, but I know you remember, you can look back to the time in COVID, in the beginning especially, when you probably were like, what should we do? No one knew what to do. It was like really all over the place. So do you think elected officials have some magic powers where they just know exactly how to handle an unprecedented event?
Right.
They don't.
This time I would know to distrust everything I heard from public health officials, to not follow any of the locking downs or mandates, that they have no idea what they're talking about. I think you're right. I think we would not overreact the way we did last time if we were to go through it again.
But sometimes people say better safe than sorry. So we'll just say that we learned hindsight's 2020.
We have a lot more topics to talk about on Rising right after this.